Colton Hale ordered a wife the same way he ordered fence posts, by mail, in bulk, with no room for defects. He wanted a woman between 20 and 30, healthy, quiet, willing to cook, sew, and disappear into a kitchen when he needed silence, which was most of the time. He did not want conversation. He did not want opinions. He especially did not want a woman who had once dined with senators, which is exactly what the Boston matrimonial agency sent him. Her name on the paperwork was Josephine Ashford. That much was true. Almost everything else about her was not. And the lies she carried onto that train in a false-bottom trunk would end up saving his ranch, ruining the richest man in the territory, and teaching Colton Hale that the woman he ordered was never, not for one single day, the one who actually arrived. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Colton Hale was 34 years old, built like the fence posts he split by hand, and about as talkative as one. By the spring of 1883, he had 300 acres of Wyoming grassland, a cabin he'd raised log by log with his own 2 hands, 40 head of cattle, and a mortgage at the Cheyenne Trust that came due every October whether the market cared or not. What he did not have was a wife, a cook, or a single soul who would notice if he didn't come back from the north pasture one evening. He had tried courting the widow Pruitt 2 counties over. She had said no, politely, over pie she hadn't offered him a second slice of. He had tried the Reverend's niece, a shy girl named Constance, who said no twice, once quietly to his face, and once, louder, to her uncle, who related to Colton anyway with visible relief at not having to lie. The problem, as Colton understood it, was not that he was unkind or poor or unwilling to work. The problem was mathematics. There were, by the county clerk's last count, considerably more unmarried men in that stretch of territory than unmarried women, and the women who existed had long since made their choices, generally in favor of men who talked more and worked less. So Colton did what practical men on the frontier did when the local math failed them. He wrote to a matrimonial agency in Boston that a fellow rancher had used 2 winters back, paid the modest fee, and asked, in the fewest words he could manage, for a woman who could work hard and wouldn't complain about it. He got a reply 6 weeks later. Her name was Josephine Ashford, 26 years of age, of good health and thorough domestic training, willing to relocate to a Western territory. The agency's letter said nothing about her father, or the Boston newspapers, or the particular reason a woman of her background needed to vanish from that city faster than any respectable woman ought to want to. He read the letter twice at his own kitchen table, decided it would do, and wrote back that same afternoon accepting the match. He did not know, folding that letter into an envelope, that it was the last simple decision he would make for the better part of a year. 3 months before that letter reached Wyoming, Josephine Ashford had been the only daughter of Charles Ashford, a railroad financier whose name had once opened every door on Beacon Hill without a single word needing to be said. Charles Ashford had built his fortune the honest way, which was rare enough in that business to be remarkable, and had taken on a partner named Everett Cole 11 years earlier because Cole understood contracts in a way Charles never fully trusted himself to. That trust was the mistake that ended him. Over the course of 2 years, Cole restructured their joint holdings through a series of amendments so dense and so carefully worded that Charles Ashford signed away control of his own company without ever understanding, until it was finished, that he had done so. It was legal on every page. It was theft in every way that mattered. Charles lost the company first, then the house on Marlborough Street. Then, 6 weeks after the second loss, his heart simply stopped at his own kitchen table with the final foreclosure notice still folded in his hand, as though he'd been rereading it for some clause that might still save him. Everett Cole sent a wreath to the funeral. Lilies, expensive ones. He did not send an apology, and he did not attend, citing business in New York that Josephine later confirmed did not exist. She remembered standing at the graveside in a borrowed black dress, her own having already been sold along with most of the household's better clothing, and counting, almost against her will, how many of the mourners were creditors rather than friends. Most of Boston society that had once filled her father's parlor for supper did not come at all. Reputation, she learned in the space of that single afternoon, was a fragile thing that dissolved considerably faster than debt ever did. A family solicitor, An elderly man named Mr. Prescott, who had known her father since their own school days, pulled her aside after the service and pressed an envelope into her hand. Inside was not money, which she badly needed, but a single folded letter in her father's own handwriting, dated some months before his death, addressed to no one in particular, simply titled, "In case I am ever asked to explain myself." It described, in careful, lawyerly language, his growing suspicion that Cole had been restructuring their partnership against him for years, and his intention to begin quietly compiling proof. He had never finished. Josephine understood, reading it by lamplight that same night, that she would have to finish it for him. Josephine inherited nothing from her father but a stack of ledgers she had secretly copied by hand, page for page, over 11 years, a habit he'd insisted on without ever explaining why, back when she was a girl of 15 who thought it was simply a strange way for a father to teach arithmetic. She also inherited a debt collector's card, left under her rented door twice a week by men working for creditors who assumed, wrongly, that a woman alone had nothing left worth taking. She did not answer the Boston agency's advertisement for a rancher's wife because she dreamed of frontier life, of cattle or wildflowers or any of the things the pamphlets promised. She answered it because Wyoming Territory was 3,000 miles from anyone who knew her name, and because a woman who no longer existed on paper in Boston could not easily be found by men who wanted her father's ledgers back, ledgers she had not yet decided what to do with, only that she could not leave them behind. She packed one trunk of clothing and one trunk with a false bottom holding 11 years of copied paper and told herself, boarding the train west, that the paper mattered considerably more than the clothes. Colton expected a plain woman in a plain traveling dress who would step off the train, offer a polite handshake, and get straight to work without ceremony. What stepped off the platform at Cheyenne on the 9th of April was a woman in a traveling coat that had cost, by Colton's private estimate, more than his last 3 cattle sales combined, carrying a trunk considerably too heavy for its modest size, and holding a posture that suggested she had never once, in her entire life, been told to hurry. "Mr. Hale," she said, before he had managed a single word of greeting, "I should tell you plainly, before we go any further, I am an excellent cook. I am a competent seamstress, and I will not pretend to be less intelligent than I actually am for anyone's comfort, including yours." Colton had, in the 6 weeks since her letter arrived, rehearsed several possible greetings for several possible kinds of women. He had rehearsed nothing whatsoever for this one. "Ma'am," he managed, "I just need someone who'll last the winter." "Then we're already negotiating," Josephine said, "which means I intend to last considerably longer than that." He picked up the heavier of her 2 trunks without asking what was inside it, mostly because his arms moved before his pride caught up. That small, unthinking courtesy, more than anything either of them said on that platform, was the first thing Josephine genuinely liked about him. He did not know, loading her trunks onto the wagon under a sky already threatening rain, that the papers hidden in the false bottom of that heavier trunk would one day be the only thing standing between his ranch and a man named Everett Cole, a man who, Colton would learn 4 months later, had just quietly purchased the Cheyenne Trust and every mortgage note it held, including his own. The ride back to the ranch took 3 hours. They spoke, by Colton's later recollection, perhaps 40 words the entire way. Neither of them minded the silence nearly as much as either expected to. The cabin had 2 rooms and 1 stove, and Colton had spent the entire previous evening building a wall of stacked crates down the center of the second room, so there would be, in his own careful words, a proper line between them until matters were made official by a reverend rather than a signature on an agency form. Josephine inspected the arrangement in silence, set down her trunk, and seated herself at the kitchen table before Colton had finished offering her the chair. "I have terms," she said, "before we go any further tonight." Colton, standing awkwardly with his hat still in his hands, said nothing, which she correctly read as permission to continue. "A room of my own, as you've clearly already arranged, until we are properly married by a circuit reverend, not merely an agency contract. A bookshelf, built before the first snow, since I did not travel 3,000 miles to leave my books in a trunk, and the right to say no to anything at all, without being required to explain myself." "That it?" Colton asked, mostly because he could not think of anything else to say. "For tonight, Josephine said. He built the bookshelf inside 2 weeks, working on it most evenings after the cattle were settled, and would later admit, to no one but the horses, who kept his confidences reliably, that he had never in his life built a single piece of furniture that quickly, and he wasn't entirely sure why this particular request had mattered so much to get right, and get right fast. That first week settled into an uneasy rhythm. Josephine cooked meals that were, to Colton's private and slightly wounded astonishment, considerably better than anything his own mother had ever managed over a wood stove. She corrected his grammar twice without seeming to notice she'd done it. She reorganized his kitchen entirely without asking, moving the salt and the coffee to shelves that made more sense, which annoyed him for exactly 1 day before he admitted, silently, that she was right. And in the evenings, while he was out checking fence line, she read 3 days' worth of back issues of the Cheyenne Daily Leader cover to cover, including, he noticed when he came in one evening and found her still reading by lamplight, the financial pages, closely, with a stub of pencil in one hand and small notations forming in the margins. He noticed. He did not ask why. Not yet. There would be time enough for that question later, though neither of them yet knew how little time it would actually turn out to be. It took Josephine only 4 days to find the ledger Colton kept in the bottom drawer of the cabin's single desk, and roughly 4 seconds after opening it to understand the situation was considerably worse than he had let on to her, or perhaps than he had fully let on to himself. The mortgage on the ranch was not simply due in October, as Colton had mentioned in passing. It had been quietly renegotiated 8 months earlier. New terms, new penalty clauses buried deep in dense paragraphs. A due date that had been moved earlier without much fanfare, under a bank charter that had, she noted from a small stamp in the corner of one page, recently changed hands entirely. "Who holds your note now?" she asked one evening, not looking up from the papers spread across the table. Colton frowned, setting down his coffee. "Cheyenne Trust. Same as it's always been." Cheyenne Trust was purchased in January, Josephine said carefully, by a holding company. "Did anyone inform you of that?" He hadn't known, and admitted as much, a little defensively. Banks did not, as a rule, send polite letters announcing a change in ownership. They simply began enforcing familiar terms in unfamiliar ways, and by the time an ordinary rancher noticed the difference, the ground had already shifted beneath him like whether nobody had warned him was coming. Josephine said nothing further that evening, but she stayed up long past midnight with a single lamp and a stub of pencil, cross-referencing the exact wording of Colton's mortgage clauses against a pattern she recognized in her own bones before her conscious mind had fully caught up to the recognition. The same layered restructuring language, the same innocuous-sounding schedule of administrative fees that had appeared, nearly word for word, in her father's final ruinous contracts 11 months before his death. She told herself, folding the papers closed near 2 in the morning, that it was almost certainly a coincidence. She had told herself that before, about smaller and less costly things, and had been wrong every single time. By the start of the second week, Josephine had carefully copied the entirety of Colton's mortgage file into her own hand, the same habit her father had drilled into her as a girl, without ever once explaining its purpose, until this very moment made the purpose horribly clear. She laid the freshly copied pages beside the ones she had carried 3,000 miles inside the false bottom of her trunk. The clause structure matched. Not merely similar, identical, down to a misplaced comma in a boilerplate paragraph that some careless Boston clerk had evidently never bothered correcting across a dozen separate contracts. The name listed as the new holding entity behind Colton's mortgage was Frontier Consolidated Trust. She had seen that exact name once before, printed on a folder in her father's private office, roughly 6 weeks before he died. Frontier Consolidated Trust was one of at least 11 shell companies Everett Cole was known to use for buying distressed debt at pennies on the dollar and then calling it in hard, all under names respectable enough that no honest rancher or investor would think twice about signing. She checked the name twice more before allowing herself to believe it, cross-referencing it against a list of entities her father's solicitor, Mr. Prescott, had once mentioned in passing as companies to watch, back when watching them had still felt like an academic exercise rather than a survival strategy. Frontier Consolidated Trust appeared on that list, third from the top, in Mr. Prescott's own cramped handwriting, dated nearly 2 years before her father's death. It meant Cole had been planning this particular expansion west for considerably longer than she had assumed. It meant her arrival in Wyoming Territory, which she had believed was pure chance. A matrimonial agency, a rancher's letter, 3,000 random miles between herself and Boston, had instead delivered her directly into the path of the very scheme she thought she'd left behind entirely. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she folded the papers back into her trunk. Her voice, when Colton asked from across the room whether something was troubling her, was not nearly as steady. "No," she said. "Just tired from the reading, that's all." It was the first outright lie she had told him since arriving. It would not be the last one before the truth finally came out. But it was the lie that cost her the most to tell, because for the first time since leaving Boston, she had found someone genuinely worth telling the truth to, and she still could not quite make herself do it. Spring gave way to early summer, and the arrangement between them, built entirely on paper, negotiated like any ordinary contract, slowly began to feel like something neither of them had actually signed up for, in the best and most unsettling sense. Josephine talked Colton out of selling 3 head of cattle at a poor price to a buyer from Laramie, using arithmetic he simply could not argue against no matter how he tried. Colton, in turn, began quietly asking her opinion before making decisions instead of only after, which was, for a man built the way he was, very nearly a declaration of love spoken in the only language he trusted. They mended a long stretch of fence line together one warm June afternoon, working mostly in silence, falling into a shared rhythm that surprised them both more than either would admit aloud. That evening, over a supper he had long since stopped apologizing for enjoying too visibly, Colton asked her, carefully, in the tone of a man asking a question he is genuinely afraid of the answer to, where exactly she had learned to read a rancher's balance sheet as fluently as any banker in Cheyenne. "My father kept books," she said, which was entirely true, and told him absolutely nothing, which was also entirely true. Colton let the matter go, at least outwardly. He had his own private reasons for not pushing too hard at doors other people kept deliberately closed. But he noticed, the way a man raised on open plains notices weather changing long before the clouds themselves arrive, that his wife carried something considerably heavier than a trunk of fine clothing across those 3,000 miles, and that whatever it was, it had not yet finished following her west. A neighboring rancher, Ezra Whitfield, stopped by that same week to borrow a plow blade and stayed for coffee. He mentioned, almost in passing, that his own mortgage note had recently been called in early by the bank, 5 weeks ahead of schedule, and that he could not for the life of him make sense of why. Colton thought little of it at the time. Josephine, pouring the coffee, thought of a great deal more than she said. That same Sunday, Colton surprised her with a small gift he'd carved himself over several evenings without her noticing. A modest wooden box, cedar-lined, sized precisely to hold letters or keepsakes, though he'd had no way of knowing she owned nothing of the kind to put in it. He set it on the newly finished bookshelf without ceremony and went back outside to the horses before she could properly thank him, which she later understood was simply how the man expressed affection he didn't yet have words for. Josephine kept the box empty for nearly 2 weeks, unsure what, if anything, she was permitted to keep in a life she still expected to have to abandon at short notice. Eventually, she placed inside it a single pressed wildflower from the fence-mending afternoon, the first object she had chosen to keep in over a year that had nothing to do with survival, evidence, or escape. By July, the town of Cheyenne had noticed what Colton Hale himself had barely allowed himself to notice, that the rancher who ordered a wife by mail had somehow ended up with a marriage that looked, from the outside, considerably more genuine than half the ones arranged the traditional way. At church on Sundays, women who had once whispered about the mail-order arrangement with a certain pitying superiority now found themselves asking Josephine's opinion on household matters, on remedies, on the price of dry goods, in a tone that had quietly shifted from curiosity to respect. Mrs. Pruitt, the very widow who had once turned Colton down over pie, remarked to another woman, within earshot she likely intended, that she had perhaps been hasty in her judgment of him. Not everyone approved. A storekeeper named Harlan Voss, who did business with the Cheyenne Trust and had heard rumblings about the bank's new ownership from a cousin who worked as a clerk, took it upon himself to warn Colton privately that stirring up trouble with men as well-connected as the bank's new owners rarely ended well for the rancher doing the stirring. "They'll ruin you quietly if you push," Voss said, leaning across his own counter. "Men like that don't lose in public. They lose you your credit everywhere in the territory, and you never even see who did it." Colton thanked him for the warning and ignored it entirely, which was, by Josephine's private estimation, exactly the response she had come to expect from him and exactly the one she needed. She had spent a year learning what quiet, respectable ruin looked like from the inside. She did not intend to watch it happen twice. That same week, Ezra Whitfield's wife, Dorothea, came to call, ostensibly to borrow a cup of sugar, and stayed 2 hours asking careful, anxious questions about what exactly a call provision was, and whether her own family's small herd could survive losing the North 40 acres if the bank called in their note the way it had called in Colton's. Josephine answered every question plainly, without a hint of the condescension Dorothea had clearly braced herself for, and by the time Dorothea left, she had brought her own mortgage papers along in a basket meant to look, to any passerby, like nothing more than laundry. Josephine did not say so aloud, but watching Dorothea walk back down the road with her basket of borrowed sugar and hidden paperwork, she understood that whatever she chose to do next would no longer affect only herself and Colton. It would touch every family in the county foolish enough, or desperate enough, to have trusted a bank that had quietly changed hands without telling a single one of them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, written on official bank stationery in a clerk's careful hand, delivering the particular kind of news that quietly ruins an entire season in 4 short sentences. The new ownership behind Cheyenne Trust was calling in early repayment on all agricultural notes exceeding 200 acres, effective the 1st of September, 5 weeks away, not the 5 months Colton had spent all spring planning around. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table, in the particular way a man reads bad news hoping the second pass might somehow rearrange the words into something survivable. "They can't do this," he said, more to the table than to Josephine. "They can," she said quietly, "if the original terms contained a call provision buried somewhere in the fine print." "Did you read all 40 pages when you first signed?" He hadn't, not carefully. Almost no one did, and he said so, a little sharply, before catching himself. That, Josephine knew with a certainty that turned her stomach cold, was precisely how Everett Cole had built the greater part of his fortune. Not by breaking any law outright, but by writing contracts so exhaustingly long and so deliberately dense that honest, busy men signed away things they never intended to give up, buried on page 31 of 40. She still had not told Colton who she truly was, or what name their new creditor answered to when he wasn't hiding behind a shell company's letterhead. But watching him stare down at that letter, running numbers that refused to balance no matter how many times he recalculated them, she understood, plainly and all at once, that the silence she had been keeping to protect herself had quietly become the very same silence that could now cost him everything he'd built. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the window with her father's ledgers on her lap, listening to Colton's slow, even breathing from the other side of the cabin, and finally admitted to herself what she had been avoiding admitting for 2 full months, that she was no longer merely hiding here. She had, somewhere in the planting and the fence mending and the shared silences, begun to build a life she genuinely did not want to lose. She told him everything that night, at the same kitchen table where she had once negotiated her terms, with the same lamp burning low between them. She told him about her father and the company, and Everett Cole's slow, patient, entirely legal theft of everything the Ashford name had once represented. She told him about the ledgers hidden in the false bottom of her trunk, copied faithfully by hand over 11 years, though neither she nor her father had fully understood, until it was nearly too late, exactly what they had been quietly preparing for all along. She told him that Frontier Consolidated Trust, the very company now calling in his loan 5 weeks early, belonged to Cole, one of perhaps a dozen shell entities he used to do, at scale and across an entire territory, precisely what he had once done to her father alone in a single Boston office. "I did not come here for you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I came here to disappear, and nothing more than that. I am sorry, but I believe he has found me again anyway, through you. And I did not know how to tell you any of this without you rightfully asking why a rancher's mail-order bride happens to be carrying 3,000 miles of a stranger's private financial records. Colton was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Josephine braced herself for the wagon, for the train station, for the version of this story where a practical man sends a complicated woman back east the moment she stops being simple to manage. "You could have told me the very first week," he finally said, not unkindly. "Would you have kept me if I had?" "I've already kept you," Colton said. "The only real question left is whether you'll let me help you finish whatever this is, instead of carrying it alone the way you clearly intended to." For the first time since stepping off that train in April, Josephine allowed herself to cry in front of another living person, and Colton, who had never once in his adult life known what to do with a crying woman, simply pulled his chair closer and stayed exactly where he was until she stopped. Later that night, after the lamp had burned down low, Josephine retrieved the cedar box from the bookshelf and set it on the table between them. Inside, alongside the single pressed wildflower, she placed her father's letter, the one Mr. Prescott had pressed into her hand at the graveside, the one that had started all of it. She had carried it 3,000 miles without showing it to a single living soul. "He never got to finish what he started," she said, sliding it across to Colton. "I think I'd like you to read it. Not because I need you to understand him, because I don't want to be the only one carrying him anymore." Colton read it slowly, twice, by the low lamplight, and said nothing for a long while afterward, which Josephine had learned, over 5 months of marriage, was simply how the man carried grief that wasn't entirely his own to carry, but that he intended to help carry regardless. He could have sent her east on the very next train, quietly ended the marriage before it had truly become one in anything but paperwork, and let the Cheyenne Bank take the ranch the way most men in his position eventually did, hat in hand, pride swallowed whole, no fuss made for the neighbors to gossip over. Instead, 3 mornings later, Colton rode into town, walked directly into the Cheyenne Trust's temporary offices, and announced, in front of 2 other ranchers waiting on that same dreaded early call letter, that his wife would personally be reviewing every clause of Frontier Consolidated Trust paperwork, and that he expected the bank to answer for each and every one of them, in writing, before the deadline arrived. It was not, by any measure, the act of a cautious man. It was the act of a man who had decided, somewhere between her confession and the sunrise that followed it, that the marriage on paper had quietly become a marriage in fact, and that meant fighting for her exactly as hard as he would ever fight for the land itself. Word travels fast in a territory with considerably more cattle than people. By week's end, for other ranchers who had received identical early call letters, Ezra Whitfield among them, had ridden out to the Hale place with their own ledgers in hand, having heard through the usual channels that the rancher's new wife might be the only person in the county who genuinely understood what was quietly being done to all of them at once. Josephine had not asked to become anyone's advocate, but looking at the growing stack of contracts spread across her own kitchen table, contributed by neighbors she barely knew a month earlier, she recognized something she had not felt in over a year, that for the first time since her father's funeral, she had stopped merely running from Everett Cole and had finally started building something capable of stopping him instead. It took Josephine 9 full days and 4 separate ranchers' worth of paperwork to build the case she had never quite managed to build for her own father, alone, in a rented Boston room with no one left to help her. The pattern, once laid out side by side across the kitchen table, was unmistakable. Identical call provisions, identical administrative fee schedules, identical shell company language, spread across no fewer than a dozen ranches stretching from Cheyenne clear up to the Montana line. Every single one of them purchased cheap through Frontier Consolidated Trust within the same 18-month window, and every single one now facing the exact same impossible early repayment. What Everett Cole had evidently never counted on was a woman who had spent 11 years copying her father's private records by candlelight without fully understanding why, until the night it all finally made sense at once. Her father had not simply been careless with his own company. He had been quietly building evidence of his own ruin, one copied page at a time, and had simply run out of years before he could ever put that evidence to use. Josephine finished what her father had started. She organized the ledgers, contract by contract, into a single clear filing that any circuit judge could reasonably follow in a single afternoon. Dates, entities, named victims across 2 territories, and 1 signature, Cole's own, appearing on the founding documents of every last shell company. Because even the most careful man alive eventually grows careless by the 10th forged signature. Colton spent those 9 days riding between ranches instead of tending his own herd, collecting contracts, reassuring frightened neighbors who had never once in their lives considered fighting a bank, and fielding more than a few quiet suggestions that he was risking his own credit for other men's troubles. He gave the same answer each time. If Frontier Consolidated Trust could ruin one rancher quietly, it could ruin all of them eventually, 1 signature at a time, and the only real defense any of them had was making sure it couldn't be done quietly any longer. Dorothea Whitfield's basket of borrowed sugar turned out to hold the single most damaging document in the entire filing. A renewal notice her husband had nearly discarded, which named, in a footnote no one but Josephine thought to read twice, an earlier shell company Cole had abandoned after a near exposure in Nebraska 3 years prior. It was the thread that tied every other thread together, proof that the pattern hadn't started in Wyoming at all, but had simply followed Cole west after it grew too risky further east. She submitted the completed filing to the territorial court in Cheyenne under her real name, Josephine Ashford, for the first time in over a year. It felt, she would later tell Colton, considerably less like exposing herself to danger, and considerably more like finally setting down a weight she had been carrying alone for far too long without ever admitting how heavy it truly was. The hearing was held in the Cheyenne courthouse on a punishingly hot morning in late August, and Everett Cole, who had traveled all the way from Boston fully expecting to intimidate a handful of frightened ranchers into quiet, embarrassed silence, found instead a courtroom holding 5 separate ledgers, a judge with no patience whatsoever for shell companies, and a woman he had not laid eyes on since her own father's funeral. He recognized her, several witnesses later agreed, before she had said a single word. His expression in that moment, by the same witness's account, was the first genuinely honest thing anyone in that courtroom had ever seen cross Everett Cole's face. "Miss Ashford," he said, recovering himself enough to force something resembling a smile. "I'd heard you'd left Boston. I hadn't heard you'd taken up bookkeeping for ranchers." "It's Mrs. Hale now," Josephine said. "And I haven't taken up anything, Mr. Cole. I've simply finished something my father started and never had the chance to see through." Cole's attorney, a sharp young man from Denver, attempted early to have the ledgers dismissed as the private, unverified papers of a grieving daughter with an obvious grudge against his client. The judge, a broad, unhurried man named Harmon Voss, no relation to the storekeeper, as he made a point of clarifying for the record, asked a single question in response that ended the objection before it truly began. "Counselor," Judge Voss said, "if these are merely the private papers of a grieving daughter, perhaps you can explain to this court why the misplaced comma on page 14 of Mr. Hale's mortgage appears in identical position on page 14 of 4 other contracts entered into evidence, none of which Miss Ashford, Mrs. Hale, had any occasion to draft herself." The attorney had no answer that morning and did not attempt one again. Ezra Whitfield testified next, plainly and without embellishment, describing the early call letter that had arrived at his own door the same week as Colton's, and the 5 sleepless weeks he'd spent wondering whether his daughters would grow up on land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, or on someone else's charity. 2 more ranchers gave similar testimony, each one describing letters worded so nearly identically that Judge Voss had them read aloud back to back, so the courtroom could hear for itself how little effort Cole's clerks had bothered to make toward disguising the pattern. The evidence itself took under an hour to present in full. The signatures matched precisely. The clause patterns matched precisely. The dates matched with a consistency far too exact to be dismissed as mere coincidence, and Judge Voss, who had personally lost his own cousin's farm to a distant bank 2 years prior and had never once forgotten the particular sting of it, voided the early call provisions on every single affected ranch, and referred Frontier Consolidated Trust for full federal fraud investigation before the court even broke for its noon recess. "Mr. Cole," the judge added, before adjourning, "you built a fortune out of contracts too long for honest men to read carefully. You've just watched one woman read every page of 5 of them out loud. in under an hour, in front of witnesses. I'd suggest you consider, on your ride back to Boston, what that ought to tell you about the durability of that particular business model. Cole did not go to prison that particular day. Justice on the frontier, more often than not, did not arrive as one clean and satisfying verdict. It arrived slowly, through the quiet loss of a banking charter, the gradual collapse of a once untouchable reputation, and the steady, silent withdrawal of every investor who could no longer afford to have their own names spoken alongside his in polite company. It was, in the end, enough. Colton kept his ranch, free and clear of the manufactured debt. Ezra Whitfield and 3 other families kept theirs as well. And Josephine Ashford, for the first time in well over a year, walked out through the courthouse doors into open daylight without the slightest need to disappear afterward. Colton married Josephine again that October, properly this time, by a circuit reverend, in front of actual witnesses instead of an agency's signature, with a bookshelf full of her late father's painstakingly copied ledgers standing quietly in the corner of a cabin that was, for the first time since he had raised it log by log, entirely and permanently his own. Ezra and Dorothea Whitfield stood among the witnesses that day, along with the 3 other ranching families whose land had been saved alongside Colton's. Dorothea brought a jar of preserves as a wedding gift and told Josephine, quietly, before the ceremony began, that her daughters would grow up knowing a woman had once ridden into a Cheyenne courthouse and stopped a rich man from taking their home, and that this fact alone was worth more to her than any sermon the Reverend was about to give. Colton had ordered, 6 months earlier, a quiet wife who would cook, sew a little, and stay well clear of his business affairs. What had arrived instead was a woman who could read a balance sheet more fluently than any banker in the territory, who had buried a father and outlasted the man who had quietly killed him, and who had somehow turned a plain business arrangement neither of them had truly wanted into the only kind of marriage either one of them could have possibly survived. They stood outside the cabin that evening, after the guests had gone, watching the last of the light drop behind the ridge the way it had the evening she first stepped off that train with a trunk too heavy for its size. "You never did ask," Josephine said, "why I insisted on the bookshelf before anything else." Colton considered this. "Figured it was important to you." "It was the one thing I could ask for that was entirely mine," she said. "I'd spent a year owning nothing outright, not even my own name, for a while. I wanted one shelf in the world that was simply, plainly mine." "It still is," Colton said. "Whole cabin's yours too, far as I'm concerned. Has been since about the 2nd week, if I'm honest, long before either of us said so out loud. The best things in life, it turns out, are never the ones you order. They are the ones that simply show up on your doorstep, uninvited and unplanned, and stubbornly refuse to be anything less than exactly what they actually are." If this story stayed with you until the very end, tell us in the comments below, what was the exact moment you knew Colton Hale was truly in love? And if you're hungry for another story about 2 people who found each other squarely against the odds, you already know precisely where to find it. Everett Cole never returned to Wyoming Territory. The federal investigation referred by the Cheyenne court took the better part of 2 years to conclude, by which time 3 more of his shell companies had collapsed under similar scrutiny in Nebraska and the Dakota Territory, uncovered by other clerks, other widows, other quietly determined people who had simply been waiting for someone else to go first. He was never imprisoned. Men of his particular means rarely were, in that era, no matter how thoroughly their schemes were exposed. But he lost his seat on 2 banking boards. His name became a quiet warning pass between territorial lenders for a full decade afterward, and the fortune he had built on other people's ruin dwindled, year by year, into something considerably smaller and considerably less admired than it had once been. Josephine kept her father's ledgers on the bookshelf Colton built her, not as evidence any longer, but as a record, proof, she said, that a quiet, careful, unglamorous kind of persistence could eventually outlast even the loudest and best-connected kind of wrongdoing. The ranch is still there, if you know where to look on an old territorial map. The bookshelf, according to the County Historical Society's records, survived 2 later renovations of the original cabin before the whole property was finally sold out of the family in 1951, sold, notably, at a considerable profit, and entirely on the family's own terms. If you're enjoying this journey through the American frontier, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps this channel continue bringing you heartfelt stories filled with courage, family, sacrifice, love, and unforgettable twists. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until our next story, remember that the greatest treasures are often hidden where the world forgets to look.